The other day, I posted a video critiquing Pastor Josh Howerton, and afterwards, a gentleman named Matt emailed me a link to this short video where Howerton talks about what he thinks is like the best presentation of the gospel he's ever heard. So thank you, Matt, for doing that. And I thought it was interesting. So we're going to play this clip, and then I'll offer my thoughts on the other side.
This illustration I'm about to give you is the best illustration of this. It's called the gospel, the best illustration of the gospel I've ever heard. Once upon a time in a far off country, there was an ancient king who was known to be simultaneously the most loving and just king who had ever existed. Eventually it was discovered that somebody was stealing from the king's treasury, and because the king was just, he issued a decree. He said that when it was discovered who was stealing from his treasury, that a sentence of 10 lashes in front of the entire kingdom would be visited upon that person as the penalty for their disobedience. The theft continued, and eventually he issued a final decree. 40 lashes would be visited upon the person who was stealing from the king's treasury. But watch this, 40 lashes was a death sentence. So he issued a death sentence. As weeks went by, it was eventually discovered that none other than the daughter of the king was the one who was stealing from his treasury. When that was discovered, a question began to ripple through the kingdom. How could the most loving king who's ever existed kill his own daughter? Some people thought that he would pardon her, but then how would he be just? Some people thought that he would punish her, but then how would he be loving? Well, eventually the king examined it, and he said, hey, the law is clear. Sin has taken place. Justice must fall. The sentence must be passed. And the king's own daughter was brought in front of the entire kingdom. And when she got to the front, she was laid over an executioner's table. She was tied to the table. The executioner ripped open the back of her shirt and stepped back. But just as the executioner lifted his whip to issue the first lash, the king stood up from his throne and he yelled, "Stop!" Everyone was in dismay. Silently, the king walked forward, bent over his daughter, wrapped his body around his daughter on the stump, ripped the shirt off of his own back, looked back at the executioner and said, "Now hit her." The executioner objected. "King, I can't hit her without hitting you. Now hit her." 40 lashes fell upon the back of the king over the back of his daughter, and the king died, and the girl went free. That was done for you. Because God is just, punishment for sin had to be paid, but because God is love, he chose to make that payment himself. And here's the good news. What you must understand is that when Jesus hung on that bloody cross and he pushed up on his nail-pierced hands, choking to death on his own blood, his final words through his choking breath were the words, "It is finished." He did not cry out, "I am finished." His words were, "It is finished." And if he's not finished, you're not finished. This
Hey, well, yeah, I have a lot to say about this. First of all, obviously, it's some sort of ham-fisted attempt to appeal to a penal substitutionary interpretation of the gospel. So that's the first thing to get on the table. And I'll say this, that when pastors like Josh Howerton conflate a penal substitutionary theoretical interpretation of the gospel with the gospel, they do their congregations a deep disservice because now any critique presented at the penal substitutionary account they presented becomes de facto a critique of the gospel itself. So that if the penal substitutionary interpretation is vulnerable to various moral or logical objections, then that just means the gospel itself is vulnerable to these moral and logical objections. And so you distort what the gospel is, and you make it vulnerable to refutation by conflating it with your chosen theoretical interpretation. Don't do that. Of course, that's what he does here. So that's the first thing to note. The second thing is, and this is a bit of a sidebar, but I think it's worth noting that there's a lot of things here that are just a little odd in terms of, to give a concise analogy of a penal substitutionary account. The one thing that I think is odd and problematic here is the illustration invokes a veil of ignorance that God doesn't actually, or the king doesn't actually know who is going to be punished. But it almost like implies that he's kind of obliged now to punish his daughter, and unwittingly, he didn't realize she would be the one that would be subject to the penalty. And that's odd because, of course, that's deeply disanalogous with the actual penal substitutionary account, where God is meticulously provident and omniscient and knows everybody who is going to be subject to the penalty. So I don't know why that veil of ignorance is introduced, because again, it just sort of shows that the king's hand was forced inadvertently, which of course is completely disanalogous. So why introduce a disanalogous point? And then there's this weird thing about having the execution be, well, first of all, having a build up to the execution. Why start with 10 lashes and then go to 40 in the story? Why not just say that anybody who does this wrong thing must face the death penalty? It's a more concise analogy at that point. So I find the embellishments here of the graduated punishment from 10 lashes to 40 lashes just to be odd and unnecessary, to lack concision. But then also the punishment itself is odd. It's like he chooses 40 lashes, which then he has to stipulate, oh, that's the death penalty. Well, who says? Who says that 40 lashes kills you? It's just weird. So instead, he could have said, for example, any person who does this, they will face the guillotine and have their head chopped off. Uh, that would make more sense, right? Because that's clearly a death penalty. No doubt about that. 40 lashes, not obviously so. So that just makes more sense. But those are a bit of a sidebar. I now want to come to what is really, in some respects, the central issue, and that is how bizarre this account is. Note that Howerton, kind of muscle memory here. I've talked a lot more about Stanley Hauerwas in my life than I've talked about this pastor, and so that's what happens. But the way that he tells this story, it's really bizarre. And it's interesting how he assumes this is going to be deeply moving and meaningful to his congregation. And that's something I want to highlight. I mean, just look at the picture. It's like the king says, yeah, put her up there and lash her to death. But then at the last minute, he gets over her and says, no, lash me to death instead. And then he says, because the justice requires that someone be lashed. But of course, that's not what justice requires in the story. Justice requires that the person who did the crime would receive the death sentence, not that some rando receives the death sentence in lieu of the person who should receive the death sentence, that it can be transferred. Death sentences don't get transferred between individuals. This is a bizarre, and this is the key thing to note is this is at the very heart of the account. Substitution, the idea of the punishment, the penalty being substituted and transferable to another individual from the daughter to the king. And of course, that completely breaks down as an illustration. Imagine, I mean, just imagine that in real life. If the king said, "Well, she must be punished," so then he climbs on top of her and he says, "Lash me to death instead." And then roll my dead corpse off and she's free to go. I mean, the law never said that. This is just bizarre. What it does is it has the initial crime of the daughter stealing, but then it has the additional crime of killing the king unjustly for the actions of the daughter. It explains nothing. And the next thing to note is just how grotesque this all is. This is supposed to be the good news, the euangelion, the proclamation of God's love for all humanity. And what is the picture? God is being tortured to death by some agent. Um, and by the way, something else I wanted to come. I'll come back to that in a second. But God is being tortured to death by some other agent, and then we walk free. It just doesn't make any sense. I mean, again, if this happened in real life, if you were in a kingdom, let's say you were visiting some kingdom where they still have kings, and he did this in a big public display. He climbed on top of his daughter and then was lashed to death, and his corpse rolled onto the ground dead, and then she walked off free, covered in his blood. Would you be thinking, oh, wow, what a wonderful example of justice and love? Or would you be thinking, I got to get out of this country as soon as possible? This is bizarre. Clearly, the latter. This does not make any sense. And I want to come back in my final point to talking more about why it doesn't make sense or what this reveals. But first, I just want to talk about one other thing. In terms of, to go back to my earlier points about the analogy and how this is disanalogous, of course, in the standard analogies for penal substitution, in the best analogy, what you would have is God the Father is the punisher, God the Son is someone analogous to God the Son, and the analogy then takes the place and is punished by God the Father. But in this analogy that Howerton shares, it's not God the Father who is the punisher, it's some other agent who's an executioner, and then the equivalent of God the Father steps in. So it's just kind of disanalogous to the doctrine of the Trinity, if that's kind of a concern to you. That's so to think that this is the very best illustration he can come up with for the gospel shows to me that this guy probably shouldn't be in the pulpit. Except the way that he emotes, he's a good speaker, he's a good public speaker. So the way that he emotes, he has the appropriate pauses, pregnant pauses, and the right voice inflection as he speaks. And so he might almost persuade you to think that what he's shared here was really meaningful and moving and powerful, even though it's just frankly bizarre. Okay, now finally my last point. Yes, the whole picture is bizarre. This is not a picture of love. This is a picture, not a picture of justice either. This is a picture of violence and injustice, random violence and injustice, and extreme violence, right? Execution by 40 lashes. So then why did people get so moved by it? And this is where we come to the question of the concept of a plausibility structure. Plausibility structure is a set of background beliefs within a doxastic community or a belief community. And it's a set of beliefs which normalize particular beliefs and practices. So these are background presuppositions that then inform certain beliefs and practices as seeming very normal and meaningful. And within an evangelical subculture framed by penal substitutionary thinking, this just triggers them. This sounds good because within their plausibility structure, they've been taught to think this is very meaningful, that it's just, and that it's loving. Outside of that plausibility structure, it's recognized, I think, to be obviously anything but. And that is what we find. The best illustration of the gospel that Josh Howerton can give us is, in fact, I think, a terrible illustration.